Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us here on the Infinite Prosperity Podcast. My name is Louisa Havers, and I help high achievers, entrepreneurs, and coaches lift the lid on life and business so that they can live at their highest value. Each episode, we will bring you our favourite founders, CEOs, and guest experts to share with you their insights and strategies to expand your wealth consciousness, your spiritual leadership, and aligned business strategies. We know that living in alignment with your soul's mission is what fulfills you, and we are here to show you how to achieve this in an energetically aligned way. If you haven't already, be sure to claim your free abundance activation in the Akashic Records. Go to louisahavers.com/gift to unlock your abundance activation today. And if you'd like my support in having aligned success in life and business, then contact me at www.louisahavers.com and let's explore together if it's an aligned match. Get ready to live at your highest value and to expand into your next level of money as you elevate and receive more. You create more for others. Righty-ho, let's dive into today's episode. Welcome to this week's episode. I am so excited to be joined by Don Wood for our conversation today. We are going to be diving into a topic around addiction, trauma, anxiety, something that I know just impacts society as a whole. So this is going to be an episode close to everybody's hearts. Welcome, Don.
Thank you, Louisa. I'm glad to be here.
I'm so excited to have this conversation with you because you really are an expert in your field. So that everybody knows what I'm talking about, I'm going to share your bio if that's okay. So
sure.
Don Wood, author, speaker, PhD, founder and CEO of the Inspired Performance Institute and creator of the patented TIPP method. Well, I have to ask you what that is. TIPP is a cutting-edge method inspired and developed through the newest developments in neuroscience and designed to clear away the effects of disturbing or traumatic events, repurpose old patterns and set the individual's mind up for peak performance. In essence, it reboots the brain's stuck thought patterns, making it possible to enhance alpha oscillations with a non-invasive and effective shift in brainwave activity. Fantastic. And Don is the author of 2 top-selling books, Emotional Concussions and You Must Be Out of Your Mind. Congratulations. This is just so exciting.
Thank you. Very good. I appreciate it.
You're
I've actually got 2 more books coming out.
Have you? What are they, Don? Give them a quick
one is on
now.
golf because I'm a golfer.
Oh, wow.
And it's called the 15th Club. Because are you a golfer?
No. Crazy golf.
Okay. So in golf, you're only allowed to carry 14 clubs. So I say the 15th club is your brain.
Oh, I like it.
And so you need to work as much on the 15th club as you do on the other 14 clubs. Because I work with professional golfers and I tell them all the time, you'll stand out on the range and hit ball after ball after ball. But what are you doing for your brain? That is their most important club. So that's called the 15th Club. And then the next book that's coming out is called Don't Mess With My DNA.
Oh, I love that.
And what it is talking to parents about how childhood trauma affects the way your child's DNA is read and transcribed. And so you need to understand the impact, even what the emotional concussions. It doesn't have to be big T trauma. It can be an emotional concussion that can affect the way your child's DNA is read and transcribed.
Absolutely. These are powerful, powerful books. When do they come out, Don? Just so that
we were supposed to be July 27th, and our publisher ended up moving, had a big move going on, so it's being pushed back to probably September. Okay. So I think it's probably going to be sometime in September. The next 2 will be out.
Oh, perfect. And for our international community, can people buy that on Amazon, or is it your website?
Yep, Amazon. They'll be on Amazon, and there'll be a number of places. The publisher looks after all of that. So I'm excited about that. I think the Don't Mess With My DNA is very powerful because a lot of people have no idea the effects and why this is happening. So I give a lot of the science behind it and what's actually happening. And the good news is it's not permanent. So you can fix it, which is very, very powerful.
Yeah, it's huge stuff. I know this is going to really resonate with my audience and also with all the mentors that I train with the Helix Method. So I was just making a mental note to read it so I can recommend it to the community that I train as well. I would love to take us back to the beginning, because I always am so intrigued to find out how people end up doing what they do. And there's always a story and a journey behind that. What's your journey? How did you start your business and it evolved to doing what you're doing now?
It's very interesting because I've been a serial entrepreneur all my life. So how I got into this was my daughter ended up with Crohn's, and which is an autoimmune disorder. And then she also ended up with a second autoimmune disorder called idiopathic pulmonary hemosiderosis, which is where the iron in the blood gets released. And
Right.
so it's an autoimmune issue. What we discovered was that she had had some trauma that we were unaware of when she was a little girl. And so the second disorder, the hemosiderosis, could be a death sentence. So that's when my wife said, you need to figure this out or we could lose our daughter. So I went back and got my PhD and I started to put the research together, and I made the connection between childhood trauma and a lot of these diseases.
Yeah.
And how does trauma affect the body and the mind? And what I discovered is that unresolved trauma creates inflammation in the body. The inflammation compromises the immune system and your neurotransmitters. So what happens is you get sicker and you feel bad. And the solution that they're taking to it is to basically medicate everybody, manage, live, and cope with it. And so I think the advantage for me is I came in with a whole different approach. I came in as an entrepreneur saying, we have a problem. How do we fix it? Yeah. Had I come in to just learn how to be a psychologist therapist, I would have just come in with the attitude of we need to live, manage, and cope with all of these things, which is the treatment they use. And I said, no, how do we fix it? So I think that was a big advantage as an entrepreneur. Yes,
a huge advantage. And what a gift that you were able to come up with all that research to be able to support, your family, because there's a motivation, isn't it? A personal motivation to be able to help your daughter.
Big motivation. And the good news is no more Crohn's, no more hemosiderosis. They're both gone. Once we resolve the trauma, right, we fix the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I see that in my work as well. And I think it's we need to shout this message out from the rooftops that so many people haven't yet heard and been and really had their eyes open to the different options that are available to them, aside from going to the doctor and the man in the white coat and who's telling you to do X, Y, and Z, and us blindly following down that path, and then not getting the results that we often desire. So I can't wait to share your message with the world, Don.
Well, a lot of times they just don't understand it. And it's not that they're not smart, because they're smart people. They don't get a degree, in what they're doing without having a lot of intelligence. But the problem is that if you read the same books as everybody else, right, you're going to come up with the same answers as everybody else. And that's the problem. So when my daughter she ended up with a cyst formed on her ovary a number of years back, and she had it removed. And so what happened was, that's another story, but they removed the cyst, and the doctor said after the operation, he goes, I'm confused. He says, your chart says you have Crohn's. She goes, yeah, I have Crohn's. He goes, well, I operated. There's no evidence that you have Crohn's. And she goes, no, I haven't had a flare-up in a while. And he goes, but you're not on medication for Crohn's. She goes, no, I don't take any medications. And so, Louisa, what he said to her, he goes, well, I hate to tell you this. You've never had Crohn's. You were misdiagnosed.
Oh, right.
And she says, no, I've had 4 resections. I've had 24 inches of my intestines taken out through 4 operations. She goes, I've had Crohn's. He says, well, Crohn's doesn't go away. It's either active or suppressed by the medication. That made no sense to him. Yeah. That you could fix it. Yeah. Because that's not what he's trained.
Of course.
And what I said to him is, I told him that once we resolved the trauma, right, that the inflammation came down, and he goes, that's impossible. He goes, if that was true, you'd have a Nobel Peace Prize. And I said, well, you tell me what Crohn's is then. He goes, Crohn's is a lifelong debilitating disease with no cure. And I said, I disagree. Crohn's is inflammation. Yeah. And I believe it was caused by the trauma loop that kept running.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's incredible when you must have blown his mind.
Oh, totally blew his mind. No.
And this is why it's so important, and I thank you for sharing that, because of course, where we're working, we work alongside our colleagues, don't we, in different roles that they're having, and it is that different training that people have. And like you said, if we are reading all the same books and going to come up with the same solutions, and not really asking different questions, I always talk about with my communities members is, we create from the questions we ask ourselves, and if we're asking the wrong question, we're going to come up with the wrong answer, as it were. And so we need to be really mindful of the types of questions that we're asking ourselves, so that we can create the results that we desire.
Exactly. And if you go to medical school, they don't encourage you to give your opinion. In fact, that's not encouraged. They want you to learn what they're teaching you. So they've got a very strict formula for the way they want things done. And I understand that, but at the same time, all the research that's being done takes years and years and years. I didn't have that. If I had waited for the research, will eventually they come up with this answer? Probably. I just accelerated it on my side.
Yeah.
And because I didn't have anything interfering, everything that I did was for a purpose. And so when I was learning, I had to learn everything I had to learn, because, I had to get my degree. But at the same time, I was challenging all of those things.
Yes. Oh, it's fantastic. And one of the things I just are wanting to bring this in, because I know that many of our community members, and certainly in the female community, fibromyalgia is a thing where you'll often hear people saying it's a lifelong condition, and I disagree. So I just kind of want to put that out there for anyone who is listening, that is resonating with some of these diseases that we are mentioning here, whether it's Crohn's, fibromyalgia, some other ones,
lupus, IPS, MS. I believe that most of those are coming from this trauma loop. And that's the response. So what actually happened, that's what I talk about in the book, Don't Mess With My DNA, that what we're now discovering is that it actually affects the way the DNA is read and transcribed. So what happens is, when there's a trauma that happens, it actually changes the methylation of the way the DNA processes. So a methyl group will either break off, which will then change the way that DNA is read and transcribed. So then it will then either turn on or turn off certain genes. So if it turns off some of the immune genes that deal with the immune system, which is what I believe happens, and then it also turns on the inflammatory genes. So now the inflammation comes on. So people would say, well, that's a dysregulation, dysfunction of the system. No, it's not. It's actually designed to protect you. So what a lot of people say, inflammation is the problem. Inflammation isn't the problem. Chronic inflammation is the problem. It stays in an inflamed state. So inflammation is designed to protect the system. It's designed to go into a cell danger response to protect the system from any bacteria or foreign invaders getting in, so that it can attack it. So what happens is that that's a temporary pause in the system to protect the system. The problem is that trauma runs on a loop. So it turns on to do exactly what it's designed to do, is to protect the system and fight the foreign invaders, fight the infection, whatever it is. But it stays on, and it's not supposed to stay on. And so then that's going to create a whole host of health problems, not only physical, but mental as well. It'll affect the neurotransmitters. It'll affect the immune system. So my daughter's Crohn's was literally a cell danger response because of the trauma that she experienced at 6. But as far as her mind was concerned, that trauma kept running, so it had to stay in an active response. When we resolved the trauma, inflammation comes down, the system goes back in, right? It's almost too simple to believe, but it really is. And I talk to people all the time when they come in and they say, well, I'm dealing with depression. And I say, what if I told you depression is a function of the brain, not a dysfunction of the brain? And they'll say, well, how could that be a function? Why would I be depressed? Is that good for me? I said, yes, because your mind has a problem that it can't resolve. So it's created a lot of pain, whether that's, anger or fear or whatever it is. And it's running this loop, can't fix it. So how does your mind protect you? It shuts down to stop that pain, that emotional pain. So it goes into a very depressed state because it can't resolve the problem. Resolve what the mind has been trying to fix, the depression will lift.
I love how you frame that. I think it just provides so much clarity for people who, and I'm sure there's many people that either have experienced depression at some point in their life, or they'll know somebody who has. And often I'll hear people feel like they're coming from a place of something's wrong with me, I've got depression. So I think it's so helpful that being able to understand it from the lens that you provided of really thinking, no, there's nothing wrong with me. That I've now got a way forward in terms of being able to look at how I can resolve this. So I think that's beautiful. I feel like that's a writer downer for people to be able to take away.
Well, that's what I say when they first sit down with me. And I have people sometimes will cry, right? I'll say, there's nothing wrong with you, and there's nothing wrong with your mind. Your mind is doing everything for a purpose. So depression, even anxiety, has a purpose. Your mind doesn't do anything to hurt you. When people say, oh, I sabotage myself all the time, or I've got self-destructive behavior, I say it's impossible to sabotage yourself. Your brain's not capable of sabotage. It's a survival brain. It's trying to keep you alive. It's trying to protect you. Now, it may look like it's sabotage because you've got something really good going and all of a sudden you start doing something that's not good for you. But why would your mind do that? It's got a reason. It's fearful of something, so it's going to move you in a different direction. Now, that'll look like sabotage, but it's really not. It's coming from a fear, from some experience that your mind thinks we're going to run into danger. We need to protect ourselves, and it'll move you in another direction. So all of those issues, whenever anybody comes in, they'll say, I have anxiety. And I'll say, no, you don't. Anxiety is the symptom. It's not the problem, right? Let's get to the root of the problem. Anxiety is just the symptom of the problem. Why would your mind be anxious? If you've had a lot of experience with pain, a lot of trauma, why is your mind anxious? Because it's fearful. It's trying to protect you. It's trying to get you on guard, alert, looking for this problem. The issue, Louisa, is that the way memory is stored, memory is being reviewed in real time because your subconscious mind doesn't know the difference between real or imagined, and it has no connection to time. So for my daughter who had her trauma when she was 6, as far as her mind was concerned, that trauma was still active. It doesn't know that she's not 6 anymore, but it's seeing it as a 6-year-old. And it's going to activate a response to it. So the purpose, and I always explain this, the purpose to an emotion like fear, the purpose of fear is to escape a threat. The purpose of anger is to attack a threat. So if you think about something that happened to you 20 years ago and your heart starts to pound in your chest, that's a glitch. It's an error message. Your mind is looking at memory from 20 years ago in real time and thinks it's still happening. That's going to physiologically change everything in your system. It has to. Because if it thinks there's a threat, it's going to activate your nervous system. It makes perfect sense. So the key is to get to the root of the memory and reset it, reboot the system so it stops calling for the action.
So powerful. And you've explained it so clearly for everybody. I think that's That's just incredible. And recognizing those pieces of those emotions that we can all resonate with, you know, fear, anxiety, anger, depression. Most of the time we'll be able to feel those emotions and move through them. It's when they get stuck, and as you were talking about these traumas that we haven't resolved, what are the things when you think about, well, what would you say, how do things that happen to you in childhood become unresolved traumas later on in life? Because it's when they bubble up later on in life. How else do you see them showing up?
That's a great question. When we have a traumatic event, your mind, and only humans do this, we have an explicit memory system. No animal has that. Animals don't learn through storing memory. They learn through associations and repetitions. That's how they learn. We learn that way as well. So we have two memory systems. We have that associative repetitive memory, but we also have a second memory called explicit memory. And that's how we store in explicit detail events and experiences in our lifetime. So everything you've ever seen, heard, touched, or smelt in your lifetime has been recorded and stored in that explicit memory. So if I asked you what you ate for dinner last night, can you tell me what you ate for dinner? What did you have?
What did I have? I had a dirty vegan hot dog.
Okay.
If you'd asked me on a different day, Don, then I could have said you had a Buddha bowl.
But when I asked you that, you looked up, right? So when you watched the recording of this and you saw pictures, right, of what you ate, maybe where you ate it.
I did, because they gave me the wrong order.
But that's how you stored the information about dinner last night. No animal does that. That's why you can feed a dog the same thing every day. They haven't stored that information. But we as humans store all that. Now, last night wasn't threatening or disturbing, even though it wasn't good, right? It wasn't a threatening event. So all your senses were just average. But if you were in a threatening situation, like a traumatic situation, all your senses are heightened: sight, smell, hearing. So how's it going to record that? High definition, tremendous amount of detail stored in that memory. This is where the glitch is going to show up. So if you've got that memory stored in high definition and somebody asks you about it or something reminds you about it, and your mind then goes in and starts reviewing that old data, when does it think the old data is actually happening? Right now, because your subconscious operates in the present, has no connection to time. So memory is being reviewed in real time, and that's going to activate your nervous system. I never use the word trigger. I never liked the word trigger because I always thought trigger sounded negative and violent. Your mind's not negative and violent. It's trying to protect you, so it activates.
I love that.
It has to activate. It's designed to activate. You don't choose to be afraid. It's an autonomic nervous system response. Your mind responds in fear to protect you. But imagine if a memory from 20 years ago could do the same thing as it did 20 years earlier. Now, 20 years earlier, it made perfect sense to have fear. That was the proper response to a current threat. But it continues to operate to a current threat, even though it's 20 years later. That is then going to create inflammation that becomes chronic because it'll stay in an inflamed state because it keeps reviewing this unresolved trauma. So what I do in the TIP program that you mentioned earlier is I take you through the process of resetting that high definition traumatic memory into the same format as to what you ate for dinner last night. And then your mind can recall the information, right? But it's not going to feel the threat.
Yeah, it's magical. And, you know, this is the kind of stuff that I do work with my clients with as well. And it is such a joy when you're able to see that shift, when they've been able to move beyond that nervous system being activated when they recall those traumatic events. It's just occurred to me that it might be worth explaining the sort of the subtleties around trauma, because sometimes people may think trauma is just like some big, whether it's like a car accident or a big event. But of course, there is that complex post-traumatic stress disorder that people can have when it's experiences they've had over their lifetime, you know, as a child and growing up through adulthood. When you're talking about trauma, because I know you work with a range of people, are you typically working with people who have these sort of big one-off traumatic events, or the more complex style type of trauma?
Both, actually. A lot of people don't realize sometimes that they've got that complex, right? Trauma. So if you grew up in a house, you know, like my wife, my wife had that
Mm.
because she grew up in a very violent home with a very angry father, but he wasn't like every minute like that. It was just this explosive temper that would show up, but that kept their whole family off guard
Mm.
because everybody's in fear. So my wife was living in fear. When I met her, it would take something as simple as me saying, "No, I don't like that." She would tear up and start to cry and say, "Why are you upset with me?"
Mm.
And I would go, "I'm not upset at all." Like, to me, I didn't say anything. And yet she's tearing up because as a child, she had learned to listen very carefully to the way her father spoke. So if her mind heard something that sounded similar, so maybe I had a little tension in my voice because I was tired,
Mm.
or, maybe on the drive over, I was frustrated, it was traffic or whatever. I'm not upset at her,
Mm.
but she could hear that subtle change in the way I was speaking and that tonality. And then her mind would interpret that as you're in danger now. And so there she'd start to cry.
Mm.
And so that kind of thing ongoing wears down the system. It's not supposed to do that. And so like I said, I work with, and that the second book I wrote was called Emotional Concussions, just for that reason, because not everything is a big T trauma.
Mm.
They can be little things that a teacher said, a coach said to you, a sibling said to you, and then those still are running and having an impact. So people would say, well, that's not a big deal. That doesn't bother me. I had one lady who said, oh, I had a very great childhood and, really, no trauma in my life at all. And so I was doing a group, this company. And so she came up to volunteer and I'm like, why would you volunteer if you said you haven't had anything? Right. So she's going to test the system. So I said, can you think of at any time in your lifetime where you've had, some sort of an event that was emotional for you? And
Mm.
she had to think about it. And as she was sitting there, she goes, oh, yeah, okay, I've got one. And so as she starts to describe it, I can see her eyes filling up with tears as she starts to talk about it. And what she said was, we were in church. I was about 6 years old, and I was in church with my family, and I was talking. And my grandmother took out her hairbrush and hit me on the head and said, stop talking, you're in church. And then the waterworks came. And when she finished and finally was able to catch her breath, what she said was, I lost my voice that day. She didn't ever connect those two. She
Mm.
goes, I never say anything. I never stand up for myself. People push me around all the time. She goes, I realized it was that day. Now, was her grandmother trying to do that?
No.
No.
Yeah.
There was no intention on the grandmother's part, but a child who's 6 years of age heard, we don't want to hear you.
Mm.
That's the way she interpreted it.
Mm.
And those kinds of things have an impact. So even my wife, Bridget, had a similar, not quite like that, but a little different, where she was invited when she was 6 to a tea party with all the little girls in the neighborhood that mothers had put on. And when Bridget showed up, her grandmother had her all dressed up in a beautiful little dress with her hair done. And as she walks up, one of the mothers goes, oh, look at Bridget. She's going to be a real heartbreaker when she grows up. And all the other mothers are agreeing, oh, yes, that's a real heartbreaker. Now, Bridget's telling me this story in her 30s and sobbing. And what she heard as a 6-year-old is that she was a bad person and going
Mm.
to hurt people. She says, I felt sick and wanted to go home because
Oh,
she's growing up
of
in that
course.
traumatic home, right?
Mm.
And then as a 6-year-old, hears these women saying,
Mm.
yes, you are a bad person. Now, were
Mm.
they trying to do that? They were complimenting her, but a 6-year-old has no clue what that means.
Of course, and they're not aware of the context of how it's going to be received as well.
Yep.
It's and with our adult brains, when we can start to piece the jigsaw puzzle together, it makes sense how our consciousness has evolved as it has. I would love to take us back to, you mentioned about your book, Emotional Concussions, and would love to understand what you mean by, what are emotional concussions? And you've also mentioned something to me about atmospheric conditions. Or, what are these?
So the emotional concussions was a way for me to let people know that, because when the people would say, oh, I don't have any trauma, which could be true. They don't have any big T trauma, but they have a lot of little smaller bumps, and I use the word concussion because when we look at concussions, we understand what a physical concussion is, right? It's a bump.
Yeah.
Right. So it didn't kill you, right? And it just hurt you and you got hurt a little bit. So it could be something somebody said or did that you wouldn't define as a trauma. But those things, and that's why I said, so my wife, Bridget, this is before I'd ever developed the program. She's in her 30s telling me this story about what happened to her as a child and crying. That was an emotional concussion. Nobody was trying to hurt her, right? But a child doesn't have enough understanding of language. It's actually, I put this in the book. It's actually a funny way to describe it. I had an idyllic childhood. So I had this amazing home. I never got yelled at, never got hit. But my mom used to say this term all the time. And she said, it's difficult to make ends meet. Now, I remember as a child thinking, why are they trying to put two pieces of meat together? Right? Now, that's not emotional concussion, but it shows the language confusion of a child. A child doesn't understand that terminology. So in my mind, I still remember that distinctly. Whenever she would say that, I would envision meat trying to come together. But it's what happens to children. So again, without any intention, right, a child can suffer that. And so emotional concussions can come from different areas. They could be deliberate, where somebody, tells you you're stupid, you're never going to be good enough. I use my wife a lot as an example because she had, a teacher that put her up in front of the class and then started firing multiplication questions at her. And she froze.
Yeah.
And again, so when she told me that story, she was sobbing. And so what did it mean to a child? I'm stupid. Right? And so she would never speak in public or go up in front of people and talk. But it was coming from that event, And so, and then what I termed atmospheric conditions are all of those events. What kind of atmospheric condition did you grow up in? So I grew up in this very sunny, bright atmospheric condition. So I was living in this world that I thought everybody had. I had no idea that I was the anomaly, right? Yeah. I thought everybody was living with my parents and having my life. I had no trauma, nothing, ever happened to me. And so it was brand new to me when I saw the dysfunction in my wife. We met at 18. So all of a sudden I'm around her family a lot more and I'm like, wow, this is unusual.
Yeah, what's
right?
going on?
A family that deals with this. Right? And I had no idea that existed. I had no idea that a lot of my friends had been sexually abused by 2 teachers, 2 principals at our school. Wow. The guy who ran our Little League for 35 years. Nobody talked about it.
No.
So nobody knew it existed. I had no idea that a lot of my friends were physically, emotionally, and sexually abused. And so that was news to me. So I talk about atmospheric conditions as being the overall kind of world that you grew up in or you still live in.
Yeah.
What are your atmospheric conditions? And that's what I say is, if you understood the atmospheric conditions of a person's life, you would now understand why they do what they do and why they behave the way they behave. So it really takes understanding. So that spouse that fights with you when you say something to them all the time. And then what do? You fight back. But if you step back and said, now I understand why they do that, right? If I understood their atmospheric conditions, I'm not going to respond the same way. So it's teaching
Very
people
liberating.
understanding, right? That a person's atmospheric conditions is what's creating the way they're responding to their environment today.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's such a great way to help people really see the full picture of a person, and to not just see the isolated incident that you're perhaps presented with at that moment. And a huge kudos to your parents. I think everyone's probably, who hasn't had that upbringing, thinking, oh, your parents sound amazing. We need to duplicate them.
Well, that's actually why I wrote the book, Don't Mess With My DNA. I think that was really a big factor for me, why I've been healthy all my life, right? So I was adopted. So we didn't know at the time. I knew I was adopted from birth, so I'd always knew that. My brother and sister are no genetic connection to me at all. None of us have ever been hospitalized or sick. Louisa, I couldn't create that kind of an experiment. It's so perfect, right?
Yeah.
And I really, truly believe it was because of that early childhood and ability to develop a very strong immune system. I never had an attack, and so I developed that resilience and that strength. And if you haven't grown up with that, and you've grown up, so why did my daughter get Crohn's, right? That was because of the trauma. Not because of her atmospheric condition that she was living in her home. She was living in the same kind of home I grew up in. That's what threw me off for so long. Because until I truly understood what this was being, because we thought, oh, take her off of gluten, take her off of dairy, all these things that they told us to do with Crohn's, where it was really just not really coming from that side. It was really coming from the unresolved trauma, continuing the loop. Keeping the inflammation active. And if you don't resolve the trauma, you're not getting to the root of the problem.
No, absolutely. You've got me thinking in terms of some of the big ones that people can face. If we think of, the big mental health conditions, experiences that people can have, anxiety, depression, panic attacks, all fairly common, and obviously on different scales. I think it would be great to hear your reflections on, from your perspective, what is anxiety and a panic attack? And I think I know what the answer is to this, of course, but is it possible to stop panic attacks? I have got a colleague who has panic attacks, so I'm going to direct her to our conversation after we've finished.
Well, I actually got a patent on our program for panic attacks, because what I say, a panic attack is absolutely solvable. The problem is they don't understand what it is. A panic attack is a combination of psychological and physical. So it differs from anxiety. So a panic attack is coming from some sort of traumas that have happened earlier in their life, or some sort of experiences that their mind, right, are constantly reviewing. So here's what I explained when I wrote in the patent. If the mind is feeling fear for some reason, right? So you may not be aware of it. So you and I could be sitting here and just having a conversation, but your mind is Google searching everything that's going on. What do we know about that? Could be a smell, could be a sound, could be an atmosphere that you're in, right? A situation that you're in. So if your mind is looking for the lion, I use this sort of as a metaphor, it's looking for the lion, but it can't find the lion. So on a very, very low level, it starts to physiologically make some changes that you're not aware of. You don't feel them. So your heart rate's going to start to change, which is then going to start to change the oxygen CO2 levels. So now you've got a physiological change happening. Signals are going to be sent to your brain that we need more oxygen. So the brain that was looking for the lion, thinking we're in trouble, just got a confirmation that it created on its own loop, right?
Yeah.
That why would we need oxygen? Well, we must be starting to get into trouble. right? So then it starts to speed up the lungs, right? Which then starts to change the different physiological things. So the oxygen's changing, the CO2's changing, the pH of the blood is changing. So the body keeps sending messages to the brain about these changes, which are all the changes that would happen if you're in a threat. So how does the brain start interpreting it? We're in danger. So it starts to slowly build it up, can't find the lion, but thinks there's a lion. So it goes, boom, panic. And now if you talk to people who have panic attacks, they'll tell you that they come on instantly, but that's not true. They've been building for up to an hour and you're not aware of it.
Amazing. So a whole hour.
Up to a whole hour before. But you didn't even know it was happening. So we've created a device that you can wear on your ear that will detect a panic attack up to an hour before. It will know that it's coming, and then I've given you all the tools to shut it down.
Amazing.
And so we can absolutely stop them. So we have a guy, Kirk, who works for us. He had 30 years of panic attacks, and this was almost 10 years ago that he was dealing with that when he came to join us, and he has no more panic attacks, like zero. I had another guy, 45 years of panic attacks. We shut those down. All you have to do is understand what the problem is, right? And it's just the way the system works. And so there was a study done at a Southern Methodist University. So after I wrote the patent, I found this study that had 2,000 hours of data on panic attacks. And what was so funny is at the end of the study, they said, we don't know what to do about it, but we figured it out. What they said was they had 13 people experience a panic attack during the study. All 13 people were monitored physiologically, right? They had about 17 different things that they were looking at, including heart rate, oxygen, all that. All 13 people said the panic attack came on instantly, but the data was showing that the system was actually, so it validated my patent after I wrote it.
Oh, that's amazing. I love that. It's like a wink from the universe going, yeah, you're right, Don.
Yep. So you can shut that down.
You've got the answer, which is
the answer.
Phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. So if somebody is listening and has got panic attacks, just as a little aside, we'll pop all your links in the show notes, of course. Can they just reach out to you and find out how they can, stop them with you?
Yes. Yep. So, and like I said, the first thing we're going to do is take them through the TIP program, which resolves the unresolved trauma. That's the biggest thing to get taken care of, right? And then just basically train the system to how to deal with them if they start to come up, and then you just shut them down.
Yeah, beautiful. So that was the TIP method that I mentioned in your bio. So that is a program that you take everybody that works with you through. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's a 4-hour process where you learn all the science and education about how your minds work. And then what we do is then take you through some techniques to resolve the trauma, right? And then we work on performance, because ultimately our goal is to get you to perform at your highest level.
Love it. I love it. And, this just makes so much sense. And it's such a gift to be able to do it so quickly. I think that's the thing, is you don't have to be in therapy for 25 years to process everything nowadays. You can be able to have really, really fast results.
And the great part about this, Louisa, is I don't even need to know what the trauma is. Yeah. I can do this without them even sharing their trauma. People will say, well, how would I be able to do that? And the techniques that I use will take them through a process. Their mind knows what it is. Is it important for me to know? No. All we have to do is get your mind to resolve it. So if you have somebody, say a woman who had a rape, right? The last thing that she wants to do is sit there and start talking about it.
Exactly.
So I'm going to take them through a process that I'll say, I need a minute or 2-minute highlight reel, like a movie trailer, right? And they can do it just visually. So I have no idea what they're visualizing. And as I take them through it, we can resolve it. And people are blown away that it can happen that fast. Yeah,
it's music to my ears. And I just think it's really important for people to really know that you can resolve this trauma without having to speak about it. In my language, I would say, if we're talking about it all the time, we're adding more energy to it, and you're kind of making it bigger and bigger. And so it's so important to be able to resolve it without having to go down that rabbit hole again, and to be able to work in this way as you're describing. One of the other things I wanted to talk about that and to get your reflections on, because I think they're all linked, they can all be linked, is one of the other top ones that we can see in society is addiction. Mm-hmm. From your perspective, what would you say addiction is? Is it a disease?
I've never believed in that model of a disease. Now, here's what's interesting. People say, what do you know about addiction? I've never had a drink in my life, never touched a drug in my life, ever once. But I never had their pain. Addiction is all about pain. And so the way our brains learn is it's just a giant computer. So it's learning through its experiences, and then it builds codes. I believe addiction is a code. It's not a disease. So if every time I think about something, I feel emotional pain, and I take a drink or I take a drug and that pain stops, what am I teaching my brain? That there's a solution to this pain. So it's going to build a code. And addiction is just that code. It says, oh, we know how to stop this pain. We just take this drink. So I had a lady come in who had been on heroin for 7 years. And she said to me, I told my therapist I was coming to see you, and he told me that I have to be honest and upfront with you and tell you I have self-destructive behavior. And I smiled at her and I said, really, what would make you think you're self-destructive? And she looks at me and she says, I'm sticking a needle in my arm with heroin. Don't you think that's self-destructive? I said, no, I don't. I think you were doing that to feel better. And I'll bet you when you stuck the needle in your arm, you felt better. Now, no one had ever said that to her before.
Yeah.
Right? And she goes, well, yeah. And I said, that's what you were trying to do. You're not destructive. The substance is destructive. So if we get that pain resolved, that the heroin is shutting down, you won't need the heroin. And then we're going to build a new code that trains your mind that you don't need it, right? That's all you need to do. And so we're getting people out of addiction. I had one lady just sit there and cry. She goes, nobody has ever said that to me before. They told me I'm broken, I'm defeated, there's something wrong with me. And I said, the reason I've never taken drugs or alcohol is not about my character, my morals, my ethics, or my willpower. It's about pain. If I had had your pain, I would have found a resource too. That doesn't say anything about you. That's human behavior. No one wants to be in pain. Exactly. That's why we go to the doctor when we have pain, because we want it to stop.
Yeah, right.
So I said, what does that say? And so your brain will code whatever it wants to help you. It's never trying to hurt you. And that's where people would go, well, addiction is hurting you. The subconscious operates in the present. So when does it want pain to stop? Now. So if your whole system, your survival brain, operates in the present, is it possible to see consequences to actions? It's impossible. It can't see a second from now. So it can't make the connection between this drug and addiction. Your conscious mind can, your logical, reasonable part of your mind, but it is not in charge of survival. It's your subconscious. So your subconscious wants the pain to end. When? Now. The drug did it. Problem solved.
Subconscious is like, I won. Yes.
Yes. And then you repeat it. And the more you repeat it, you're building the code stronger and stronger. And that conscious, logical, reasonable part of your mind, the intellectual part of your mind, can never override that. Yeah. And that's why with AA and NA, they teach people you'll never, ever not be a drug addict or alcoholic. You're going to have to fight it every day. That's true if that's your mindset.
Yes. Yes.
But when I tell them you can absolutely defeat this, right? All you have to do is get the pain resolved and then work on the codes.
Absolutely.
And we can work on the codes. We can recode that very easily when the pain's not interfering with making the changes to the codes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things, and addiction's not my area of expertise, but something that has always I've challenged in my head and through conversations with colleagues and clients and offered it as a perception is, if we keep telling ourselves we're in recovery, it's a bit like I'm giving up smoking. We're always in that perpetual place. You're keeping yourself in that place. Whereas if it's in the past, then the coding has happened and you've moved on from it. So it's something that I've always queried from my own angle around that. People saying that they're continually in recovery.
I never liked that. I always thought that is very defeating.
Me too.
And I look at it, just say, take an Olympic athlete and say, okay, for the next 4 years, you're going to get up at 4 a.m., you're going to eat this, you're going to be exercising, training, you're going to go to bed at 10 o'clock at night, right? You're going to do that for the next 4 years. You're never going to be on the Olympic team, though. I don't care how good that athlete is. You're telling them they've already lost.
Yes.
Why would they continue to do it?
Yeah.
You're setting them up for failure. So when you tell people you're never, ever not going to be an addict, you've just put a mindset into them that becomes their identity.
Exactly. And then they can become addicted to going to those meetings forever and ever and ever because they're too scared to let go of them because of their wanting to be committed. I'm grateful to hear your reflections on that as well, because it's something that I've always kind of questioned and thought that just logically does not make any sense from a psychological perspective to have people kind of keep imprinting that into their consciousness.
Well, you look at, when was AA developed? In the 30s.
Yes, of course.
That's when we were doing lobotomies. We were doing lobotomies on people, right? So we didn't know enough about the brain. So I'm not blaming them. I get that was something that at the time seemed to be a way to help people. So I'm respectful of what their motives were.
Absolutely.
Right? But we know enough about the brain now that we don't have to stick with that model. You can change the model, but it's pretty ingrained.
It really is at a cultural and societal, global level,
Global level.
It really is. Yeah, absolutely. It's something that with gentle conversations with people, we can start to help them to see a different way. And it's that evolution, like you were saying. I'd forgotten about the lobotomies. Terrific. But isn't it fantastic that we can have these conversations now, and through the power of the internet to be able to really speed up the conversations and people's awareness around there being another way, and the other way isn't the wrong way, and that they can perhaps explore that, perhaps if they have been clean or whatever the language is for however many years, that they can move through and change their identity to be able to feel more successful.
Yeah. And if you don't get to the root of the problem, right, you're just, I call it, you're painting over rust.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you have to really sand it down, get to the root, right? Sand it down, prime it, and then paint it, and then it'll be fine.
Yeah, you've got to do the trauma work. There's no way around it.
No, it's actually why AA and NA struggle, is because they never really do the trauma work. Or what they do is they talk about it and like we said, reinforce it. And that's really a lot of times what those meetings are all about, is making it, they sit around and commiserate about how bad their life was. And it becomes a giant pity party. And, I had one lady, she had been in addiction for 17 years, had OD'd twice, came in to see me, and she's now 4.5 years clean. I mean, phenomenal turnaround story. She lost her daughter. They took her daughter away from her. She was literally living on the streets. Her parents had disowned her. They were raising her daughter. And, she's now got her daughter back. She's working full time. She's got her own business, not gone back to drugs and alcohol. It's an amazing turnaround story. And she followed exactly what I told her to do. And she didn't miss anything. And it resonated with her.
Yeah.
And so as long as you follow the process just works. So people say,
Yeah.
well, what if I don't believe it's going to work? And I said, you don't have to believe in science for science to work. It
It's
just
gonna work
works.
regardless. Yeah,
Just
exactly.
follow the
Yeah.
process and watch it work, right?
Yeah. I feel very passionate about more and more people hearing about this. You know, it's just reflecting as you were sharing that. My brother lost his best friend when he was 21 to heroin overdose after the day he came out of rehab. He just went
Yep.
went back to his old patterns. And so the trauma was unresolved, of course. Otherwise, the brain isn't going to sabotage inverted commas in that way, and
No.
to soothe that pattern. I would love to shift gears a little bit and to hear your reflections on, you know, because you mentioned about performance, and I know this is a key part of like the work that you're doing and ultimately helping people to improve their performance. And you use the language around rebooting. So how does rebooting the mind help performance? And can someone really break a world record simply by changing their mindset?
They absolutely can. Here's what's fascinating. Again, I think it was such an advantage for me coming in, and I had such a clear outlook of what I was trying to do, that unresolved trauma actually affects the mitochondria, the ATP energy production in the cells, because a lot of that energy gets taken up by this trauma loop and by these threat responses. So what we know is that if the ATP energy in the cell is affected and the mitochondria is affected by this trauma, what's going to happen when we resolve the trauma? That energy becomes available that was running the loop. So I've worked with world-class athletes. So a great example is Marco Cicchetto. Marco was a double amputee. That was his trauma. He lost both his legs to a suicide attempt. He was a marathon runner from Kenya. And they taught him to walk again with prosthetics, and then they built him blades to start running marathons again. And then they called me up and they said, we think Marco's really got some great potential, but he's hit a plateau. He's not improving anymore. So we really believe it's this trauma that may be doing it based on what they knew I did. So Marco came in to see me. This was in February of 2019. And I took him through the program. I explained to him, Marco, there's nothing wrong with you. I know exactly what's going on. Let's get this trauma resolved. And 9 days later, he runs in a race and he takes 15 seconds per mile off his time.
Wow.
Which is huge. And then about a month later, he runs in the Boston Marathon in 2019 and breaks the world record. He's now the world record holder for marathoners with amputations. And what I said to him, I said, Marco, I didn't make you a faster runner. You were always that fast. You just didn't have the access to that power. It's like we've added that cylinder back into the engine, right? That the cylinder was always there, right? But that cylinder was really running the pump for the energy for the trauma. So once we free that up, they have to perform better. There's just no choice, right?
Yeah.
And so I worked with a group who work with world-class athletes, and they measure heart rate variability on these athletes. They're constantly measuring heart rate variability to sort of test what's going on. I took them through the program, and the one guy stopped me and he said, you just blew my mind. He said, we could never understand why these prime athletes in the peak physical condition would go into a sympathetic nervous system response at rest when nothing was going on. You're telling me it's that trauma loop? And I said, yep. They said, we never understood it. It never made any sense to us. Now we get it. That trauma loop is running. It's going to pull power and it's going to change, right? Even though the person doesn't know it, just like the person didn't know a panic attack was coming. So you meet people who are really high functioning people. Like if you had met my wife, Bridget, I'll guarantee you would never know she came through trauma as a child. Very high functioning, right? It was the Wizard of Oz. Behind the curtains, I could see the struggles that she was having, but she presented extremely well. And a lot of people who are performing at a very high level look like they're performing at their peak, right? They actually have another gear. And that's what I talk about. We just got to get you to that next gear. Once we resolve the trauma, then you can reach another level of performance.
Love it. I love it. And we think that we've only got so much capacity, but then being able to really expand that to, as you say, to optimize your performance by going up a gear. I could chat to you forever. It's just like one of my favorite conversations to have, because I just think there's, humans experience trauma, and it's just like an epidemic. And so this is just one of the most important conversations that we've had on the Infinite Prosperity podcast. So very, very grateful for your wisdom and your expertise, and to, inspire everybody to kind of really do that self-reflection of, where they might be holding some unresolved trauma that they're not even aware of, that they could perhaps take a look at, and to be able to go up a gear in their performance. Just to wrap this up, and you'll have, I'm sure, covered this during our conversation, but, what would you say would be like 3 tips for entrepreneurs who are wanting to have more success in their business?
The book Emotional Concussions was actually written for business. It was more towards business. So what I talk about is there are certain things that show up, certain symptoms that will show up if you've had some of these emotional concussions. They'll show up in things. So one of the things that I talk about is, number 1, don't be afraid to fail. And that can become an emotional concussion, that failure gets connected, right, to pain. So if you had a parent that was very demanding, about your performance, and you fail at something, then you start to equate that connection. But what I talk about is, as entrepreneurs, it's just failure after failure. Don't be afraid to fail. The best advice I ever got is when I was 13 years of age, the tennis pro who was teaching me, hockey and tennis were my 2 big sports. But he said to me at 13, he says, "You really want to be a great tennis player, right?" And I said, "Yeah." So he said, "Okay, I'm going to tell you the secret." And at 13, you think there's actually a secret, right? So I'm like, "Oh, awesome. This is going to be it. I've got it now." Right? And he whispers to me, he goes, "Lose a lot." And I said, "I don't understand what you mean, lose a lot." He says, "You're playing in the 13 and 14-year-old divisions. I want you to play in the 15, 16, and 17, 18-year-old divisions. You're going to lose a lot. You've never seen the speed and power of that game before." So he said, "But you're a really good athlete. The more you get exposed to it, the faster you're going to get." He says, "But if you've never seen it, you don't know how to make that adjustment." He says, "But the problem is you're going to lose a lot because they're bigger and stronger. And as long as you're willing to take those losses to learn, right, you're going to improve." You talk about one of the great life lessons. That's not just about sports. That was about life. I was never afraid to fail. I was never afraid to take a loss, because from every loss, you learn something. And so that's one of the big things I always tell people: don't be afraid to lose. Losing is a part, right, of learning how to win, right? So if I wanted to keep winning, I just play in my own same division.
Yeah, quite.
Yep. The other one, and this was a big one that I had to learn along the way, is stay in your lane. Because as entrepreneurs, we try to be everything to everybody, and then we try to do everything. So we're doing the books, we're doing the marketing, we're doing the sales, we're doing all of those different things, when in actual fact, there are people that are better at it than you.
Oh, yes.
So don't be afraid to stay in your lane, right? Now, in the beginning, it's very difficult because you don't have a lot of money, right? But eventually start looking at what are your strengths, and make sure that what are the things that you're best at, you hold on to as long as you can until you can get somebody. But the things you're not as good at, those are the things that you first want to bring somebody in to do. And then the last one, which I think is really powerful, is don't be afraid to ask for help.
Oh, yes.
Right? Because you need help along the way. But a lot of times it's pride gets in the way, and I don't want to show I'm weak, so I don't want to go and ask for help. when in actual fact that the best, most successful people have always asked for help. So those would be my 3 tips.
Oh, Don, thank you so much. Those are incredible tips, really, really powerful, and something that everyone can take away. How can people come and find you, hang out in your world? And is there anything, and you mentioned your books, but anything else you've got coming up that people can come and buy from you, or, benefit from, any freebies that you may have, or what have you got coming up? Tell us all the things.
So we've got a number of podcasts, so you can go and watch our podcasts. We've got a lot of great ones. I know you and I did one as well, so I think that's up there as well. I'm doing different videos you can check out on TikTok and YouTube and things like that, where I just sort of talk about different little things, really quick little, sound bites that you can listen to as well. And you can check us out at the Inspired Performance Institute, or just look up Dr. Don Wood, PhD, and you'll find my website.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And we'll pop all the links in the show notes for everybody as well. Thank you so much, Don. This has just been an absolute pleasure having this conversation.
I've enjoyed it. It's so easy. How fast did that time go? What are we at? Wow.
I know. We could have chatted for hours and hours and hours, but thank you so much for your time, your grace, and your generosity with your wisdom and your knowledge. And thank you to everybody who has been listening. We hope that this has served you. And until our next episode, lots and lots of love. Namaste. Thanks for listening to the Infinite Prosperity Podcast. And if you like what you've heard and want to know more, please go to louisahavers.com. We just appreciate you so much. So thank you for listening and hanging out with us. If there's anything that we can do for you, you can email us at louisa@louisahavers.com. Let my team know if you have any ideas for shows that you'd love to hear or topics you want me to talk about. Really looking